So typically when you talk about, I find when you talk about security, you get this obligatory kind of scary hacker graphic, and you get the obligatory big words, lots of use of the word cyber, and some kind of atomic explosion saying that the world's going to end. Scary thing, I was showing this to a guy who used to work for a big security vendor, and he said, seriously, that's how we try and sell to our customers? Well, this is not that talk. This is, not that's out of the way. This is how we can begin to think about Puppet as a means to assisting any kind of existing security practice, any kind of process that, that you might have in your organization, or how you can use Puppet and what Puppet offers, particularly around the field of orchestration and application management, as you might hear me called as well. What that can do for us and what that does to help us not only improve the posture of our applications with regards to security, but how we can start to build a tighter feedback loop into day-to-day processes, whether that be development processes or deployments. And that's really why I'm here. A bit about myself, I spent a long time working in network test automation. I worked for, it's easier just to call them a competitor to Ixia, where I did a lot of network test automation for the likes of DISA, the Defense Information Systems Agency, and a lot of big enterprises where we were testing big links between a lot of the US military installations in the US. And you get a real sense of what it actually means to be secure when you're working in those kinds of projects. But more and more throughout, through working as an engineer in test automation and working as a software engineer and then as a development manager, you quickly realize that even though we've closed the gap between development and test and operations with a lot of the DevOps practices, the part that's consistently left out is any kind of a consideration for security processes. And what I really want to talk about is how Puppet orchestration can bridge that gap between development, operations, and security. I realize that a lot of attendees at PuppetConf come from internal IT organizations. I personally haven't been in that environment for a few years, but I find that a support organization is equally as capable as being a part of that feedback loop, albeit on a much more protracted timescale. Operations, system support will quickly show up at development's doorstep if they find issues in production. And a lot of the impetus for why I wanted to talk about this was being in that position as a development manager where a customer finds a security issue in their product that could have just as easily been found in development. And one of the things that Puppet gives us, it gives us that formal baseline for metrics through the environment service resources. This is what Ryan talked about yesterday. You're able to express your application in terms of services and how they depend on each other. And in Ryan's talk, he talked about simple things like database servers and HTTP servers and load balancers. I mean, all of those a developer thinks about and all of those operations thinks about, but it's easy to lose sight of the fact that those kinds of things, that's the attack surface for, that's what your SOC or your security practitioners are looking at. That's what they need to know to say, well, this is what the attack surface of my actual application is. And more importantly, I think it's been apparent in the organizations I've worked for, it would be an interesting conversation to have, would be, at what point do security practitioners, or what point security and security processes, where does that fit in your workflow, if at all? And the other thing that Puppet orchestration gives us is this shared code artifact that can be as sparse as rich or needed. One of the things that we were careful about when we began working on Puppet orchestration was that we didn't want to end up with a language or a bunch of tools that required you to refactor large parts of your code base to actually work. It should be something that, if you ever listen to Mike Stanky talk about how you start to employ Puppet in your organization, his rhetoric is very much that of it's small things in iterations, and starting to build in that feedback loop into day-to-day operations. And I think of all the times I've looked at security issues that have come across my desk. Maybe we did a product release and KPMG have pen tested our product in production and found some issue we didn't find in production. In every single case, I can look at a chain of failure and say, yes, that's somewhere we could have, through a tighter process, through application of automation or DevOps processes, could have resolved these things before they ever get to our customers. And most importantly, or as importantly, provides a method for deploying applications the same way every time. We're not waiting on that eventual consistency that non-orchestrated solutions have. We know that when we deploy an application, we know that once that tool is finished, that our database server's up, that our Nginx instance is up, and that potentially that there's a rule already in a load balancer for that particular application. In terms of how orchestration can support security, again, really what I want to talk about is how orchestration and, as importantly, the modeling around orchestration, what I want to talk about is how that can support existing security practices, not necessarily how we replace them. No doubt a lot of the organizations already have security teams, but it's my experience through many years at IBM and F5 Networks and previous to that a few large enterprise software vendors, is that no matter how good we were at deploying software, no matter how many times we could deploy it a day, security was always this nebulous thing that happened in some far-off place, and it was maybe weeks or months before we found out that we maybe had an issue in one of our applications. I guess the biggest thing to kind of keep in your mind is now we have this concept with orchestration of the environment graph. We're used to saying, thinking of Puppet on a per node basis. We have an SSH service that depends on the configuration file that maybe when it gets modified depends on the service restart. But now we can actually extrapolate that beyond nodes and think about nodes themselves almost become a somewhat of a minor detail because now we have that abstraction that sits across all of our, can sit across all of our nodes and actually tell us what we have deployed, not in terms of nodes or IP addresses, but in terms of the actual applications that bring our businesses value, because 10.1.100.85 doesn't bring us business value. Our Forge API brings us business value, or our online store brings us business value. And really, if we can achieve only two things with Puppet orchestration with regards to security, if we can increase the visibility of security posture of our applications in a much tighter feedback loop, as in when I deploy my application, I know, for example, that, there's a new port with a new service that's been opened up as part of my application. Well, that's information I know in a timely manner. And one of the examples I'll talk about as to how a chain of failure led to a very serious issue at a customer I was dealing with in Europe. We'll see how a lot of those processes that security practitioners will be carrying out are ideally automated. The end result of them running manually or running from a script or Puppet resource are actually the same. And secondly, to incorporate sensible and meaningful security processes into our workflows. I remember the product I worked on previous to working at Puppet was actually a vulnerability scanner. I remember the first time we deployed it to a customer, and we kind of given this guidelines to be kind of gentle, try and divide up your scan range into maybe 20 or 30 IPs, and thought our job was done. And of course, we log into the system, and these specified a full Class B address space to scan. And 4 days later, we have 400,000 vulnerabilities and 64,000 hosts. How useful is that information, really? What I'll show you is that it is useful, but actually finding out what's most useful is where I think Puppet and orchestration can be most useful. So first off, what I want to show you here is just some something I don't think that Ryan got to, and the fact that the actual orchestration tools themselves have an API. And this API lets you, it's actually what the client tools run on. This API lets you write scripts. It's just a RESTful API. It lets you query about the applications and the environments you have deployed with Puppet. It lets you see how many times that a user might have tried to deploy those applications. And most importantly, it lets you know what nodes that those applications are deployed across. So forgive me for some quick, you can see I've been doing a little bit of testing here. So this API, which comes with Orchestrate out of the box, is the exact same interface that our command line tools use in order to be able to work with applications. That means you can deploy them, you can get metadata about them, you can actually see information about how many times they've deployed, and hopefully what you can see here is a sensible implementation of a REST API. So you can see that things like basically you can drill down into each one of those. And the ones that I want to show you first are the environments. So you might have multiple environments deployed in your deployment, but you might this is a lot of information. You might only care about one, so we can let's limit this. Oops, excuse me. Let's limit this to Forge, which is Ryan's example. And I am able to run a query against that, and it'll tell us, give us some metadata about the actual environment itself. And then equally, I can find out what applications are deployed under that. And it'll tell us what parameters it expects and the kind of application it is. And then equally, whenever we actually try and deploy those applications, we are actually able to see the results of the runs. Now, I've already ran these jobs in the background, so apologies. I can guarantee you this is not smoke and mirrors. But the information you actually get back here is an overview of what actually happened when that job was deployed. And hopefully this is somewhat self-explanatory. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these, but the one I'm interested in most is, let's say, the nodes. So I want to know what nodes were Puppet ran on as part of my deployment. In this case, it ran across 2 nodes. Now, anyone that's ever worked with a vulnerability scanner knows that typically the way you set these things up is you log into some kind of web UI, and you give it typically a CIDR range or a list of IPs that it needs to scan. The problem with that is it's a brute force, a bit of a ham-fisted way to scan things that matter to you most. And that in itself is actually a pretty big problem to security practitioners. I don't know how this happened. It was a kid's birthday party a couple of weeks ago, and the head of security for EMEA for the New York Stock Exchange was there. And he happened to talk about hiring people just to remediate vulnerabilities. And he said the single biggest problem wasn't somebody who was able to understand the inner workings of some of the latest malware. It was literally finding people who knew what to look at first. He found that he had people going into, it could have been Nexpose, it could have been IBM QRadar or whatever, and they were literally picking a vulnerability off a list with little or no context and attempting to remediate it. The problem being that the actual security practitioner had no visibility into how important that particular node was to the organization. And I think what the orchestration and application management does first is that finally a security practitioner, or maybe you have this role, maybe you're not strictly a security practitioner, but you have this role in ops, is able to look at his applications and say, I need to scan these 3 IPs, or I need to remediate these 3 vulnerabilities, because the application that matters most to me is at risk because of some list of vulnerabilities that some scanner has shown up. Now, I'm not suggesting for a second that Puppet's going to start scanning producing vulnerability scanners. But the point is that with Puppet orchestration, with the ability to deploy an application and know that when you hit that deploy and it returns that your application is now deployed, you're in a position to hook in other security processes, whether it be vulnerability scans, whether you're actually just running Nmap to find out that there are no new ports open, or there's nothing, there's no rogue process, like a bot CNC that's opened up a port. All I'm saying is that with orchestration and with this ability to model an application end to end, we're not just modeling that interaction now. We're also we are able to model security processes on the side of it. We're able to model F5 rules potentially, or if not model F5 rules, introduce enough information into our model, whether that be the ports that things talk to each other on, so that we can then use that artifact to forward generate iRules or rules for web application firewalls. And just as a means of a dashboard on what I mean about getting data back to a user quickly, this was just something I kind of experimented with. You'll be able to spot, the green boxes are actually they're static, but the actual dashboard here is pulling back the list of environments and telling me how many applications I have in both. Not very interesting in and of itself, but what I'll build towards is a dashboard that actually starts to give us that overview of our security posture. Again, I'm not trying to replace existing security processes. What I'm trying to do is get us to think about those things that we know that our security teams do, and get as much of that into that tight feedback loop into each deploy, so that a deploy becomes not just a unit of move this section of code into production or into test, move that application along with baselining it for its attack service, finding out what vulnerabilities it has. And if you read this year's SANS incident response survey, this is exactly what they're saying. You can all read. I'm not going to parrot things, but the theme of it is that there's so many things that we can actually automate from a security perspective and don't. And this is, even though we realize this is an issue, we're still not getting any better at doing that. And that's really what I'm trying to get at. Again, just reflecting what the report said. And this is what I actually see. This is what I saw through 4 years of building a vulnerability scanner, even building security products. We didn't have that tight feedback loop of, I've deployed my application, now what's changed? Has my attack surface increased? Has it reduced? And we were pushing basically all those security issues as technical debt, and they really did come back to bite us. And that's really what I'm trying to avoid. And I happened to see this job advert on LinkedIn on Sunday before I was supposed to come out. Sorry? Whoops. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is a company that does a lot of work for the UK government. And what I'm really trying to show here is, here we're trying to hire someone who's going to help us with the security on our products. And the first line is asking us for someone to manually test the application for security, and instantly I'm shaking my head. But it's not like they don't realize that almost in the same job description, they actually put their finger, in my opinion, on the problem. And that's estimating vulnerability risk in the context of a specific application. And over again, when we were selling vulnerability scanners to some of the biggest banks in the UK and beyond, every single time they come back to us and they said, you're finding these vulnerabilities, but what is it I have to look at first? And you need more data besides the fact that I have Heartbleed or I have shell shock in this node. And there's many ways to do that, of course, but I think And the essence of what I'm saying is that with Puppet orchestration and the ability to make the concept of an application a first-class citizen, you're able to take that information. There's nothing to say that we need access to the SIMs or to the log management tools or whatever else that the security team is running. We have the APIs, as I've just showed you there, to be able to push for those security tools to be able to pull information out of Puppet and suck it into Nexpose or QRadar or ArcSight or whatever those things are. So that instead of scanning hundreds of hosts in the hope that we find that one critical vulnerability that could, it could fail us for PCI compliance or HIPAA compliance or whatever, that in the development process, we're actually finding those things and closing them down in short order. So instead of it happening 90 days down the road, it happens that day. Yeah, so it's still interesting. We seem to have solved the test automation problem, but we haven't realized that security issues are essentially the same thing. And again, I just want to reiterate and keep that in your mind. Puppet orchestration allows us to take those applications and express them in code. So that's an artifact that we can stick in Git, that we can open pull requests against, that we can track in version control. And I'm looking forward to experimenting with the kinds of workflows where I find that, for instance, I find 10 extra vulnerabilities in my application, not in my node now, on my application, and to be able to compare that against my actual application expressed in code and say, well, did something change in my application that's made me more vulnerable, or was it some other thing? Again, I want to reiterate that we're not trying to solve the entire end-to-end business of of those massive scans or those massive pen tests that security practitioners do. What we're trying to do is take that amount of noise and reduce it so that when our security teams actually are faced with the job of testing our applications, that what they're actually looking at is the most important, and it's worthy of their time. Again, I've kind of touched on this point earlier. It gives us the environment graph. It not only does it allow us to think of applications in terms of per node, because no doubt any of you, sysadmins probably have classes you've written to harden your servers. Well, that's great. I mean, that's what Puppet's there for, and that's why we have the Forge, for allowing us to share these modules that allow us to harden our applications. But the fact is that before orchestration, those hardening scripts were to some extent a best effort, in the sense that you may well decide to shut down a service, or you may well you will shut down several services, especially Windows boxes, which of course you shut down 90% of the services when you deploy them. But that doesn't mean to say that you have applications that are open on your machines that are also vulnerable to attack anyway. Well, it could be, think of Sony. In Sony's case, they had an unpatched web server, and that's what led to their downfall. Completely inexcusable. It wasn't some fancy new APT that all of our security vendors were trying to scare us into spending hundreds of thousands of dollars with. It was a configuration management issue, and that's, needless to say, that's Puppet's bread and butter. And really kind of what I'm getting at is the fact that, well, where is the security in DevOps? Is it the small s at the end? It's probably quite symbolic, actually, of even outside DevOps or Agile still. Security is something that's best forgot about and best left to the end. Lots of good talks this morning, really. But I didn't hear the word security pop up an awful lot. This is the life. Anyone that has worked in a SOC knows that it almost feels like you're in space. No one can hear you scream. And this DevOpsSec. Funny enough, when I was researching this, I said to myself, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go on Google and search for DevOps and stick sec in the end, and that's exactly what I got. I don't know. I didn't find an awful lot of useful content. Let's put it that way. It turns out that it was a term coined by Gartner, and it's really a call to arms as much as anything. It did have one good piece of content in it. A well-designed and developed and managed system is the foundation of a secure system. Yeah, Yeah, we kind of know that. Thanks, guys. Yeah, and it leads me on to the issue of security platitudes, and this, it does get in my goat an awful lot. Someone should really fix that is generally what you really hear, isn't it? But it's right. The fact is that this was from a Gartner report a couple of years ago. 75% of successful attacks occur against things we already know about, which is ridiculous when you think about it. In this age where we're so good at automating tests, when you guys are so good and Puppet's so good at automating the deployment of our applications, how this whole section of concern has been left out is kind of incredible. And we've all seen things like this. You know, you have an architect that decides, in fact, anyone that worked for IBM knows this. Every year you sign this document that says, I've read secure coding principles, check. I'm done, that's it. All the code I produce is secured. It's ridiculous, it doesn't work. And then, of course, you get platitudes about security platitudes. X or Y isn't enough, do all the things. It doesn't work. You know, some of these tools are quite cumbersome to use, highly specialized, and not actually built to, not actually built to be incorporated into a workflow. I don't know if a lot of you have heard of AppScan or Fortify or a tool like it. I remember talking to one of the architects in Israel for AppScan, the dynamic code analysis tool, and I was explaining to him how we wanted to take their dynamic analysis engine and incorporate it into one of IBM's log management products. And it was all good until the point he told me, yeah, it's all written in .NET and only runs in Windows. And and I asked him, do you have an enterprise version? And he said, yeah, it runs in Windows and it has a REST API. It's things are probably better now. But the point is that even some of the tool vendors are not thinking about how they can get that process into a DevOps, properly agile process, a tight feedback loop where you can get that information back to the DevOps people as quick as possible. I'll race through these slides. We know this. We know that these numbers are not important. It's the increasing cost of software bugs. And somewhere along the line that security issues no longer fall under the remit of bugs. Of course, this is a conservative estimate. Some of the well, scaremongering maybe, but the costs of the typical cost of a breach is something like in the order of $350,000 these days. And again, I'm mindful of time here. Lots of stats that basically say applications are increasingly the cause, or at the very least, we're getting no better at hardening applications against breaches. The reason I highlighted low complexity on this is because any of you that know about the CVSS scoring mechanism, this mechanism for ranking the seriousness of a vulnerability, knows that low complexity is something that doesn't require an awful lot of skill to actually perpetrate. A script kiddie could run it, and as you can see, those actually increased significantly last year. And again, the point is that this slide's making is that these vulnerabilities are in applications, and they're not in operating system applications. They're not in things like DCOM. Those days of buffer overflow attacks against DCOM and the likes are maybe not totally behind us, but they're certainly less prevalent. Again, mindful of the fact I wrote a lot of these slides on the plane between Dublin and Charlotte between Portland. I might pause for a minute to wonder what I was thinking. Yeah, I mean, the ability to quickly and consistently deploy is as important to security as it is to ops and dev. I think of one case where we found a directory, an open directory vulnerability on one of our services on a big UK bank, and had they not been able to fix that vulnerability, they'd have failed compliance and they'd incurred penalties from the Financial Services Authority of millions of pounds. Those guys, when you're faced with that, when you're faced with a customer that says we're going to invoke our clauses that say if you don't fix this, then you're liable for a certain dollar amount. It quickly becomes apparent to you that you need this ability to have security as a first-class citizen in your workflows as much as any other. And again, keep in the mind an orchestration here and what it gives us. being able to deploy applications, being able to target a fix at a particular part of your application and only deploy those nodes that it's deployed on, rather than deploying an entire environment of hundreds of thousands of nodes. Again, very powerful. And the other point I wanted to make is using security tools need not be used in a brute force manner. I mean, again, I used the example of the Class B network address space being scanned by one of our first customers. You don't need to do that. You can target a scan that says only scan these 3 IPs. You can target a scan that says only scan these open services instead of doing a full stealth mode nmap scan of a node. You can target them and thereby making them run quicker. Because one of the biggest barriers I thought of immediately when I was when I started thinking about this was, well, these things take days to run. No, they don't. If you configure them correctly, they don't take days to run. I'll get to health checks in a minute. I'm going to keep going through here. And one of the problems you have, and again, this comes back to the problem you have of all this noise in existing dashboards and tools. Typically, if you look at a security product, you get this lovely messy screen. Again, this is the same. This is IBM's. This is before IBM acquired QRadar, the old UI. The point is, you get all these lovely counters, which mean what to application developers exactly? An application developer looking at this will say, oh, look, I have target vulnerable to detected exploit preceded by exploit, blah, 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 blah. It's really not actionable. And a developer's going to spend all of 10 seconds looking at that and dismiss it. And one of the things I've been experimenting, which you kind of saw me earlier start to think about, is how you can take that security information and target it at applications. Because again, you might get something like this as well. This is the IBM's vulnerability management product. And although you probably can't make it out here, 10.100.85.129 has the highest vulnerability count. So what? To a developer, to an ops person. What does that mean? What's running on it? I don't know. And that's the point. A security practitioner looking at this, might say, well, that's very interesting. That is the highest vulnerability count. And, a more amateur or a less experienced, I should say, practitioner might say, oh, that's the one I need to look at first. But what if that's a machine buried deep in the depths of your internal network versus a machine that's in your DMZ or on the edge of your network? The point is that what these things lack are context. I don't know from looking at this if my internal intranet site is vulnerable or one of my external facing sites, and that's the problem. And part of the problem is that, as I've shown, they tend to pivot around nodes and IP addresses. They don't think about things in terms of applications. And I think very easily using a tool like orchestration that says, these are my 3 components and they're mapped to these applications. You can build dashboards or you can build feedback into your process that is able to target scans, target analytics at a very limited number of IP addresses, a very limited number of network flows, and start to get a dashboard, get an artifact in front of your ops teams, in front of your development teams that says, on the last deploy, the security posture of your application improved greatly, or it worsened. And the problem is again, is information overload. And which vulnerability needs fixed first? Again, talking to the likes of the CSOs from the New York Stock Exchange, I hear the same thing from the head of product at Raytheon's new cyber defense arm, that this is exactly the same problem. The customers are telling this is the problem. We know our hosts are vulnerable, but you're not telling us which ones we need to worry about first. And typically, if you think about what the overall term of risk, the thing with the most risk is the thing that's going to present is going to disrupt your business. Again, another example. This is from Nextbo's Rapid7's product, and again, apologies if you can't see it, but you can see that the risk on the top line there is 875,000. What does that mean exactly? We don't know anything about that. And you'd have to dig a fair bit into that figure to be able to say what makes up that figure. It tells us nothing about what our applications are doing, how they're deployed, and how vulnerable they are to attack. Because again, that could be firewalled off in the middle of your network, or it could be in the edge. We don't know from looking at these things. So what I want to see, as someone who had to talk to customers about their security solutions, was I want to be able to see orchestration drive these kinds of dashboards, even in the background. I want to be able to, instead of seeing things like ECB side or seeing things like a CIDR range, being able to say, this is Puppet Labs Forge. It has these number of nodes that it's deploying to. It has these number of vulnerabilities. And it's at most risk because your HTTP environment resource is vulnerable to, is unpatched. I am mindful of the fact I'm running out of time here, by the way. And this actually, one of the examples I have is that when we were, a product I was working on previously, we had a product manager come over to us one day and say, this was pre-release, so it was, we didn't actually have anyone buying. We wanted customers to, to start beta testing us. We need an RSS feed. We need the ability for someone to, point an RSS reader at the installation and give you the top number of, or the top 5 vulnerabilities, the top 5 at-risk hosts. So us wanting to be the good little developers and being in a culture which is very profit-driven, as if you've ever worked for IBM, you kind of know that. You live from quarter to quarter. You said, yes, we will push this feature in. And of course, we did a day's work, got the feature in, and then we forgot about it. And then you know what happened? We released a 1.0 of the product. This RSS feed was completely forgotten about. A particularly big car manufacturer in Germany, which is now, whose name is Dirt. You don't need anything else to figure that one out. KPMG ran an audit on them, ran a pen test, and down to a configuration issue, not some fancy APT issue, not some fancy binary exploit, down to us misconfiguring Jetty. There was a directory listing exploit. If you don't know what that is, it's basically where you point your web browser at an application, type .. and you can navigate the file system. And typically the first thing you see is that they've got hold of your Etsy password file and are running Jack the Ripper on it. Again, mindful of time, all kinds of things went wrong there. But the biggest thing that went wrong is that we weren't building automated security processes into our workflow. If we had even just been running Nmap, or even just running, even an open source scanner against that, we would have seen that, we have a new port open on our console. Maybe we should really look at that. And is the solution things like a secure software development lifecycle? Well, it gives you this lovely kind of high-level view of what it is you should look at. But it's in effect waterfall. And the problem with it is it's over-reliant on manual processes, on requirements gathering, and architecture reviews. Now, I'm not saying those things are bad. They obviously have their uses. But the point is that a lot of what they're actually talking about here could be automated, not least of all things like deployment. Sorry, I'm just skipping through these because I'm just mindful of time. Biggest problem, no feedback loop. This is all very manual. So what if we thought about this in terms of automation? Well, all of a sudden we take those things, what I view to be the most important things, and all of a sudden things like orchestration, things like Puppet look a lot more attractive in addressing these problems. Things like deployment, well, we're writing Puppet modules, we're writing hardening modules. It speaks for itself. But more is the point, what orchestration allows us to do here is it lets us target those things like vulnerability assessment or dynamic analysis. I will say things about, over on the coding side, you can do some kind of linting or static code analysis. Maybe you have this experience as well. Typically what happens when what would have happened back in my old waterfall days, or even in so-called agile shops, at some point someone would have ran AppScan or Fortify and said, you have these 10 vulnerable parts of code in your product. And I'd have spent the next week proving that 90% of them are false positives. I'll skip through these. This was just an overview of some IT processes. AppSec, ITSec, NetSec, the point is that all of these have some element of automation in them, some element of a low barrier to entry where Puppet can start to make, oh, I animated that, flip, that must have been on the Charlotte the Puppet leg of my flight. And one of the biggest problems you have with deploying existing tools is that, again, no one's going to attack a live application as a matter of routine. So even if you had a dedicated pen tester embedded in your team and you're an operations team, you're never going to let someone do destructive pen testing on a live production system, at least outside of the remit of a pen test. And that kind of leaves us with the passive monitoring of production systems. That means taking logs, taking configuration information, and figuring out what's wrong with it. And if you talk to security vendors like Tripwire and Rapid7 and the likes, you're gonna talk a lot about what authenticated versus non-authenticated scanning is. Authenticated scanning, non-authenticated scanning, basically useless. Authenticated scanning is what you actually is the most useful. It's where you provide a tool, credentials, it can log into the machine, it can catalog, it can look at configurations. Agent-based versus agentless. Another battle where you'll see some vendors say we're agentless, and that's a big selling point. The point being you don't have an extra piece of software to manage. Well, it turns out that you still have to manage things like user accounts. You have to manage potentially open new services, which might mean opening new firewall ports. A lot of scanners rely on you opening up the WMI service on Windows, for example. And that tends to make sysadmins very nervous, as it should. But the point is, Puppet's already on your nodes. If you're here, you already have made the choice probably to deploy Puppet onto your nodes. So you actually don't have to. These discussions are somewhat moot. You've already had that discussion of, well, do we basically have a remote execution bot on our machines? The discussions around, we don't have to open any new ports because Puppet already runs over a known port, no additional components to deploy. And what the latter part of my presentation was about was how can you leverage Puppet to address existing vulnerabilities. Again, as an example, just to get us thinking about what can I actually do with Puppet that might improve my security posture. Heartbleed is a good example. Again, a vulnerability is not a vulnerability these days if you can't package it up in marketing speak and use it to shift product. Heartbleed's a good example. What you're looking at here actually is, I remember I worked on the detection support for this the day it was disclosed. And it was code to actually, anyone's familiar with the exploit, it was the ability to steal SSL certificates from open SSL services. But the point is that the disclosure already contained all the information you needed to find out if it was on your system. And it's this. Now, it may look like garbage, but in fact, all it's saying is that if you have open SSL version 1.0.2, you're vulnerable. And it turns out that collecting this kinds of information with Puppet is actually really simple. You may already have had, I'll skip that. You may already have had, sorry about this. I will make these slides available afterwards and I can finish properly. The point is that Puppet, because you're on the node, because you're able to write custom facts to do things like maybe pull registry keys or, as some customers do, I said some of our test pilot people have been talking to customers about how they use Puppet to improve their security posture. And a lot of customers actually, they write custom facts and they pull maybe things like the number of auto updates pending and they stick it in the dashboard. And that information is right there in front of them, and it's useful because it's useful to operations people, it's useful to security people because they can see what work isn't being done. I have 49 seconds left, so I'll jump. Apologies for this. I'll jump straight to what I want to see Puppet support in the future. And it's a dashboard not unlike this. I have 30 seconds to explain how this works. I can do this. So, right-hand bar, my top 5 apps. Now, a security practitioner is not the person that's going to tell you, actually, these are my 5 most important apps. If that's going to be your operations team. And really what what I've been working on, what the kinds of things that orchestration lets you do, is it lets you package up and make real those abstractions. What is my internet application? What's my ELK stack? Elasticsearch Logstash, of course. And for those 5 apps, how many vulnerabilities do they have? Now again, maybe not that useful in terms of, back to what I said, context is everything. But of course, we've been able to drill down on those been able to find out what's vulnerable in the first place, or what application is most vulnerable is the most important thing. Unpatched Windows, as in how many Windows boxes have pending updates. Custom fact, one of our customers is already doing this, in fact, and pretty much just copied their work. They use PowerShell to write a custom fact that reports back if there are pending updates, and that's just a PuppetDB query. Overall risk, again, I know I laughed about this one. My overall risk is 23,000. Well, I've already improved, hopefully we've already improved our security posture, been able to say that figure applies to those 5 applications, and is it trending up or down? At a glance, am I getting better or am I getting worse? Well, I hope to be able to talk to some of you afterwards if I can get more coffee. I'm interested to hear what you're doing. Sorry I went over the time. I didn't cover some of the stuff I wanted to, but again, I hope we can talk further and engage further on how Puppet orchestration can start to improve how you do security in your organizations. Thank you.